It was an ordinary Tuesday at the Oak Ridge Mall, a place most people passed through without giving it much thought. Families, teenagers, and retirees browsed through the aisles, chatting with shopkeepers, or grabbing a bite to eat. The atmosphere was laid back, peaceful, a reflection of the town's quaint, small-town charm. John Mason, the mall manager, had worked there for nearly a decade, overseeing the day-to-day operations. To him, it wasn't just a place of business, it was a central hub for the community. He knew most of the regulars by name, and the mall's success felt personal to him. That morning, as the usual flow of customers wandered through the stores, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as noon approached, the atmosphere began to shift. A few murmurs floated through the air from store employees. John had learned to listen carefully to these subtle changes. Something was off. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was but knew he needed to keep his eyes peeled. Walking through the food court, he overheard one of his security staff talking on the phone, glancing at the entrance to the mall with a puzzled look. "Isn't that," the staff member muttered, not even trying to hide his disbelief. John's curiosity piqued, and he casually walked to the entrance to see for himself. That's when he spotted him, Elon Musk, unmistakable in his subtle attempt to blend in. Musk was wearing a baseball cap, low enough to obscure most of his face, but it was the bold red, "Make America Great Again," MAGA, hat that caught everyone's attention. John's stomach sank. He knew the potential consequences of this moment. Oak Ridge Mall, while not as politically charged as some other places, had always strived to be a space where everyone felt welcome, regardless of their political views. It wasn't a place for overt confrontation, yet here was Musk, a symbol of both innovation and controversy, with a hat that had become a lightning rod for political debate. Some would see it as a simple fashion choice, a harmless expression of support for a former president. Others would view it as an inflammatory symbol of division, a reminder of the toxic political climate that had plagued the nation for years. John's mind raced as he surveyed the growing crowd. Some were whispering excitedly, recognizing Musk, while others exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what to make of his appearance. The tension was palpable. The mall had always been a sanctuary from the world outside, a place to escape the noise of politics. But now, with Musk standing right in the middle of it, the boundaries between the personal and the political had blurred. John's first instinct was to approach the situation calmly. He knew how to defuse uncomfortable situations, he'd done it before with minor disputes between customers or employees. But this was different. He couldn't just let the situation unfold without intervention, especially not with the growing crowd gathering. Word would spread quickly, and before long, it could escalate into something much bigger. The mall could be caught in the crossfire of a viral story that could either make or break him. He quickly walked over to the security guard and whispered, "Keep an eye on him. I'll take care of this." His pulse quickened as he made his way toward Musk, who was browsing the electronics section, seemingly unaware of the tension he had caused. "Mr. Musk," John said as he approached, his voice calm but firm. "I'm John Mason, the manager here at Oak Ridge Mall. I'd appreciate it if you could remove your hat while you're inside the mall." Musk turned to face him, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of amusement and surprise. "Excuse me," he replied, clearly taken aback by the request. John didn't back down. "I understand you're a public figure, and I respect that," he continued. "But this is a family-friendly space. We have a policy in place that asks visitors to keep anything political to themselves while inside. We want everyone to feel comfortable, regardless of their personal beliefs." Musk's expression hardened slightly. "I don't see how this is political. It's just a hat. Besides, I'm not here to make a statement, I'm just shopping." John could feel the weight of the situation building. It wasn't just about the hat, it was about the principle. What if this was a test? What if Musk was doing this deliberately, knowing the stir it would cause? What if he was using the mall, this innocuous space, as a platform for his own agenda? John had always been a man of principles, and in that moment, he knew he had to make a decision that would either keep the peace or risk alienating part of the community. "Mr. Musk, I'm asking you politely to take off the hat," John said, his voice firm but professional. "If you refuse, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave the premises. I'm sure you understand." The tension in the air thickened. People around them started noticing the confrontation. A few pulled out their phones, recording the exchange, and within seconds, the buzz of whispers escalated into a full-blown spectacle. John could feel the eyes of dozens, maybe even hundreds, of onlookers bearing down on him. He was no longer just a mall manager, he was now the central figure in a controversy that would unfold in real time, broadcasted to anyone with an internet connection. Musk stared at John for a long moment, clearly considering his options. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he replied, "I'm not taking off the hat. You're free to ask me to leave, but I won't comply with this demand." John's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. If he allowed Musk to stay, there would be backlash. People would accuse him of being too lenient, of letting a high-profile celebrity get away with flaunting divisive symbols in a public space. If he insisted on Musk leaving, the internet would explode with outrage. The mall would become the focus of a debate about freedom of expression, corporate overreach, and the power of symbols in today's society. "All right, then," John said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the mall, Mr. Musk." Musk didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, the look in his eyes unreadable. The people around them had grown silent, waiting for what would happen next. Then, as if it was no big deal, Musk turned on his heel and walked toward the exit, his MAGA hat still perched on his head. As he passed through the door, a few people clapped, others groaned, and one woman shouted, "Good riddance." John stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the damage had already been done. The incident would be the talk of the town for days, maybe weeks. He could already hear the outrage brewing online, the arguments about free speech, the implications of a mall manager asking a public figure to leave over a piece of clothing. As John walked back to his office, his mind raced. Was it the right decision? Could he have handled the situation differently? Was he being too strict, or too lenient? He knew he would never have an answer that satisfied everyone. But one thing was certain, this incident had just made him a central figure in a controversy that would take on a life of its own. By the time John returned to his desk, his phone was already buzzing with notifications. The video of the confrontation was already making its rounds on social media. The headlines were starting to pop up: "Mall manager kicks out Elon Musk for MAGA hat" and "Elon Musk forced to leave Mall of our political hat. Is this the end of free speech?" John felt a pit form in his stomach. What had he just unleashed? The days that followed were nothing short of chaotic. By the time John Mason left work that evening, the story of his confrontation with Elon Musk had already gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, and by the morning, it was all over social media, shared, commented on, and debated. The video, where John calmly asked Musk to remove his MAGA hat before ultimately asking him to leave the mall, had become the talk of the town, the country, and beyond. There was no escaping it. At first, John tried to carry on with his routine. The mall had a set of standard procedures that he followed every day. But the weight of the situation felt like a looming storm cloud, one that grew darker with every passing hour. The phone calls started before sunrise. His wife, Karen, had picked up the phone to hear the first of many angry callers. By the time John arrived at the mall, there was no denying the extent of the backlash. People were upset, calling it an overreach, a violation of freedom of expression, and accusing John of political bias. Many others praised him, arguing that he had stood up for his values and created a safe space for the broader community. As the mall manager, John was accustomed to dealing with complaints, but nothing had prepared him for something of this magnitude. His inbox was flooded with messages, some were polite inquiries, others harsh criticisms, and many were completely irrational. A few emails, sent under anonymous accounts, included threats. One message simply read, "You will regret this." The tone of hostility was palpable, and John could feel the tension mounting. But it wasn't just the hate mail or the angry phone calls that disturbed him. It was the realization that the incident was now a symbol for something much bigger. The political divide in the country had reached into the heart of a seemingly innocuous, local shopping center. The mall, once a place of neutral ground, had become ground zero for a nationwide debate on free speech, political correctness, and corporate influence. The next few days felt like a blur. John's mind was constantly racing, trying to figure out how to navigate the storm he'd found himself in. His first instinct was to make a statement, to calm the situation, apologize if necessary, and remind people that the mall was a place for everyone, regardless of their views. But the pressure was mounting from all sides. The media requests were relentless. Journalists from local stations and national networks wanted his side of the story. Everyone was eager for a comment, a justification, anything that could feed into the narrative that had already been established. The pressure from corporate headquarters wasn't helping either. John was called in for a meeting with the regional manager, a man he barely knew but who now seemed to have an opinion on how John should handle things. "Look, John," the regional manager, Thomas Gregson, began, his voice stiff and disapproving. "We're not saying you made the wrong call. But you've got to understand, this thing's getting out of hand. The last thing we need is a PR nightmare, especially over something so trivial. You've got to smooth things over before it blows up even further." John sat back in his chair, trying to mask his frustration. He'd spent years building his career at the mall, establishing a rapport with the community, creating an environment that was welcoming to all. Now, everything seemed to be falling apart because of a single decision. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the voices from both sides demanding answers, and the sense of impending doom looming over his every move. "Do you think I'm wrong?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gregson paused for a moment, clearly weighing his words. "It's not about being right or wrong, John. It's about managing the fallout. This is a business, and businesses need to make money. We can't afford to alienate customers, especially when they're already fired up about this. Do you really want to be known as the guy who kicked Elon Musk out of a mall over a hat?" John clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to argue. Gregson's words stung, but there was a painful truth in them. Businesses were about survival, and survival meant maintaining a steady flow of customers. And right now, some customers were calling for boycotts, angry that Musk had been kicked out over something they saw as a harmless political statement. Others felt vindicated, applauding John's stance. The division was clear, and there was no easy way to bridge the gap. The pressure continued to mount. A few days later, a video surfaced online showing John's confrontation with Musk, captured by a bystander and edited with commentary. The video was both damning and sensational, a perfect storm for the news cycle. The words John had spoken in the heat of the moment were distorted, and the scene was framed as a cancel culture clash, fueling the fire even more. But then, an unexpected twist occurred. Elon Musk himself made a public statement about the incident. Unlike the hostile comments many had expected, Musk's response was measured and even somewhat empathetic. He tweeted, "I'm disappointed by what happened, but I understand the need for respect in public spaces. It's unfortunate, but we can't allow ourselves to be divided by hats." The tweet, while calm and reasonable, sent shockwaves through the media. The response from Musk's followers was immediate. Some praised him for his restraint, while others saw it as a sign of weakness. The political discourse surrounding the incident shifted dramatically. As the days passed, John started to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about a confrontation between a mall manager and a billionaire tech mogul. It was about the deep divides within society, the growing polarization that had affected every aspect of life, even the most mundane interactions. People weren't just divided on political issues, they were divided on how to navigate those issues in public spaces. And here, in the heart of the Oak Ridge Mall, John had become an unwilling symbol of that divide. He couldn't help but feel like he was caught in a web of forces he couldn't control. His decision had sparked a firestorm, and now he was left to pick up the pieces. But as much as he wanted to take the easy route, apologize, and try to bury the incident, he knew deep down that the situation was more complicated than that. The pressure from corporate, the media frenzy, the online backlash, it was all too much. John's every move was being scrutinized, and no matter what he did, there was no escaping the fallout. But the hardest part wasn't the public backlash. It wasn't the angry phone calls or the media's attempt to spin the story. It was the toll it took on him personally. John had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm, to make decisions based on reason and not emotion. But this situation was different. The decision to confront Musk over a hat, however well-intentioned, had brought a storm into his life that threatened to consume him. He couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what happened next, his life would never be the same again. One evening, after a long day of dealing with media inquiries and internal meetings, John found himself sitting in his office, staring at the phone in his hand. His wife, Karen, had been supportive, but even she was starting to feel the pressure. The stress was palpable in their home. Their kids were starting to hear about the controversy at school, and John could sense the strain in Karen's voice when she talked about it. It felt like a never-ending cycle of bad news. He couldn't escape it. The situation had taken on a life of its own, and no matter how much he wanted to retreat from the public eye, he knew there was no going back. John realized that this was more than just a dispute over a hat. It was about the moral choices we make in the face of pressure. It was about leadership, about standing firm in one's values even when the world around you seems to be falling apart. But more than anything, it was about how one moment could change everything. The days blurred together as the fallout from John's decision continued to spiral out of control. The mall had become a microcosm of the country's political and social divide, with everyone from customers to employees weighing in on the incident. The atmosphere was tense, with visitors now entering with apprehension, wondering if something similar might happen to them. What had started as a single confrontation had evolved into a nationwide spectacle, leaving John to deal with the consequences every minute of every day. At the heart of it all was the media. Every news outlet seemed to have a story to tell about the incident. Some outlets framed it as a victory for political correctness, lauding John for taking a stand against divisive symbols. Others vilified him, claiming he was stifling freedom of speech in the name of political correctness. The tension between the two narratives was palpable, with both sides accusing the other of being overly sensitive. And then there were the memes, the ones that poked fun at the situation, turning it into a punchline rather than a serious conversation. John found himself becoming the target of jokes, the subject of opinion pieces, and the focus of debates that were being held in living rooms, on social media, and even in boardrooms across the country. But it wasn't just the media attention that weighed heavily on him. It was the ripple effect within the community. John had always prided himself on being part of a tight-knit town where people respected one another, where neighbors helped each other out and families shared moments of joy in the town's quiet corners. Now, it felt like that sense of community was unraveling. The local coffee shop had become a battleground of conflicting opinions. The gym, where John worked out in the mornings before his shift, now had conversations that revolved around the incident, with heated debates echoing off the walls. People who had once smiled and waved at him now offered tense nods, their expressions guarded. He had unwittingly become a symbol of the divide. John had always been a private man, someone who valued his family's peace above all else. The constant attention, the barrage of opinions and judgments, felt like an invasion. His wife, Karen, had never been one for the spotlight, and the situation was taking a toll on her as well. She was no longer able to step out without being recognized, without being pulled into conversations with strangers who had something to say about John's decision. It had been a tough few days for both of them, but it was starting to hit its peak. Their phone calls were filled with tension, and their conversations, once light-hearted and easy, were now heavy with the weight of the fallout. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, John sat down with Karen in their living room. The silence between them was thick, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Karen broke the stillness. "John, do you ever wonder if you made the right call?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with concern. "I mean, I know you thought you were doing the right thing, but now. I don't know. It feels like it's all getting out of control." John exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't wanted to admit it to anyone, especially not to Karen, but he'd been asking himself the same question over and over again. Did he make the right choice? The consequences of his actions were beginning to feel more like a burden than a badge of honor. His decision had sparked more than just a viral controversy, it had sparked an existential crisis about what it meant to lead, to stand up for what you believed in, and to do the right thing in a world that no longer seemed to have clear lines between right and wrong. "I don't know, Karen," he said, his voice tired. "It's hard to know what's right anymore. I thought I was doing what was best for the community, for them all. But now, it's like everyone's turned against me. Some people are supporting me, but others? They're calling me a tyrant. I never thought it would escalate like this. I'm starting to wonder if it was worth it." Karen's face softened with empathy. "I know you were trying to do what was right, but sometimes, people don't see things the way you do. They don't always understand the bigger picture." John nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had never considered how something so seemingly small could turn into a moral quagmire, where every decision had a far-reaching consequence. All he had wanted was to maintain a safe, neutral space for everyone, regardless of their political beliefs. But now, in the eyes of many, he had become a symbol of something much larger, the battle over free speech, over the right to express one's views without fear of being censored or punished. And in his attempt to protect the sanctity of the mall, he had inadvertently placed himself at the center of that battle. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and interviews. John had tried to step away from the media circus, but the pressure from his superiors was mounting. His boss, Gregson, had been relentless, urging him to address the situation publicly before it spiraled out of control even further. Corporate had prepared a carefully worded statement that they wanted John to release, one that would walk the line between acknowledging the controversy and maintaining the mall's neutrality. John reluctantly agreed. It wasn't the answer he wanted to give, but he was exhausted, worn down by the constant back and forth. When the statement was released, it was met with mixed reactions. Some people praised John for coming to his senses, while others saw it as a weak attempt to backtrack. The controversy, however, wasn't dying down. It had become bigger than just the mall, bigger than even Elon Musk. The divide in the community had deepened, and now, people who had never even visited Oakridge Mall were chiming in, commenting on social media about how they felt the incident reflected larger societal problems. The statement did nothing to calm the storm, it merely fueled it. Then, in an unexpected twist, a group of local activists arrived at the mall one afternoon, holding signs that read, "Stand for free speech," and "No censorship in public spaces." They were peaceful, but their presence only served to escalate tensions further. A few supporters of John's decision confronted the activists, and soon enough, the two groups were exchanging heated words. John, watching from a distance, felt the weight of it all crashing down on him. The mall had always been a place for people to shop and relax. Now, it was a battleground for ideological warfare. It wasn't long before a local news crew arrived, cameras rolling. They captured the exchange between the two groups, adding fuel to the fire. People who had been watching from the sidelines began to take sides, and soon the incident was making headlines once again. The situation had gone from a personal decision made by a mall manager to an emblematic moment in a national conversation about the state of politics in America. In the midst of it all, John found himself questioning everything he had ever believed about leadership. He had always considered himself someone who acted with integrity, someone who put the community first. But now, standing in the middle of a political maelstrom, he wondered if that had been enough. Did his actions truly reflect the needs of the community? Or had he, in his attempt to be a moral leader, made a mistake that would have far-reaching consequences? As the days passed, John grew more and more introspective. His decision had irrevocably altered the course of his life, and as the tension continued to mount, he realized that there was no easy resolution to the mess he had created. The phone calls, the emails, the arguments, everything was reaching a boiling point. He could no longer deny the reality that his life, and the life of his community, had been forever changed. The days following the activists' protest were the darkest yet for John. The media storm intensified with each passing hour, and every decision he made seemed to be scrutinized, twisted, or misinterpreted. What had started as a seemingly innocuous incident had grown into a personal and public nightmare, and no matter how hard he tried to deflect the attention, the fallout kept spiraling out of control. The mall, once a peaceful sanctuary for shoppers, now felt like a war zone, with tension hanging thick in the air. Employees were walking on eggshells, and customers were arriving with a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and anger. John had become a figurehead of a battle that he had never intended to fight. Each morning, as he entered the mall, the atmosphere was different. Gone were the friendly greetings from the regulars, replaced by hesitant glances and whispers behind his back. The staff, who had once been his colleagues and friends, now treated him with an uncomfortable distance. No one dared approach him about the incident, but John could sense the undercurrent of resentment. It wasn't just the customers who were divided, his own team was too. Some employees believed in his actions and felt that he had done the right thing, standing firm in his belief that the mall should remain neutral ground for everyone. Others, however, thought he had overstepped his bounds, arguing that the mall was a place for all people, regardless of political beliefs. In the midst of this confusion, the pressure from corporate weighed heavily on him. Regional managers from headquarters were calling him daily, demanding updates on how he was handling the situation. Their words were polite but laced with underlying impatience. "We need a resolution," one manager had said bluntly. "This is affecting our business, John. You've got to make it right. The longer this drags on, the worse it gets." But no one could offer him a clear path forward. He was being pulled in a dozen directions at once, all while the weight of public opinion bore down on him. One particularly difficult day, John found himself sitting in his office, staring out the window at the mall's parking lot. His phone buzzed constantly, but he didn't have the energy to pick it up anymore. He was exhausted, mentally and physically. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of guilt, frustration, and regret. Was this how it was all supposed to turn out? His decision had felt so simple at the time, an instinctive reaction to something he felt was wrong. But now, the consequences were staggering. The mall was divided, his colleagues were wary of him, and the town seemed more fractured than ever before. It was then that a call came through. At first, he ignored it, but the name on the screen stopped him. It was Karen, his wife. "John, we need to talk," she said when he picked up the phone. Her voice was tense, more serious than usual. "Okay, what's going on?" he asked, sitting up straighter, instantly on alert. "I've been talking to some people, and I think you need to really consider what you're doing," Karen said carefully, her words measured. "This is bigger than you thought. You've got to think about the long-term consequences, not just for yourself, but for the family and the community too. People are hurting, John. And I think this whole situation is hurting more people than you realize." John's heart sank. He knew she was right, but hearing it from her made it even harder to ignore. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly, even though he already knew the answer. "The protests, the social media posts, the arguments. It's tearing the town apart. People are divided, and it's starting to feel like it's never going to end," Karen explained. "I don't think anyone realizes how much this is affecting you, but I see it. You're a good person, John, and you're doing the best you can, but sometimes, it's okay to admit when something's gone too far." Her words hit home harder than anything he'd heard in the last few weeks. He had been so consumed with handling the situation that he hadn't fully understood just how much the turmoil was seeping into his personal life, into their home. Karen was right, people were divided. The public spectacle had led to protests, social media campaigns, and public debates. The fallout from the incident was more than just a minor controversy, it had turned into a political and social flashpoint. John's exhaustion was palpable. It wasn't just physical, his soul felt drained. The decision he had made, one that had seemed like the right thing at the time, was now a weight he couldn't escape. He knew that the right thing to do was to resolve this, but he didn't know how. The more he tried to fix it, the deeper the divide seemed to grow. "I don't know what to do anymore, Karen," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I never thought this would be the result. I thought I was just trying to protect the integrity of the mall, make sure it was a place where everyone felt welcome. But now it feels like I've torn everything apart." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Karen spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You don't have to do this alone, John. You've got me. You've got the kids. And you've got the community, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. But you've got to make a choice. What kind of person do you want to be through all of this?" Her words hung in the air, and John felt the weight of her question. The community was waiting for him to lead, to bring some sort of resolution, but he felt lost in a sea of competing pressures. Did he stay firm in his decision, believing that it was the right thing to do, even if it meant alienating a portion of the community? Or did he apologize, walk back his decision, and try to heal the rift, even if it meant admitting that he had made a mistake? The next morning, John made the hardest decision of his life. He would publicly address the situation, not with a rehearsed statement, but with a heart-to-heart message to the community. He scheduled a press conference, knowing that it would likely be televised. His intention wasn't to pander or try to win back favor, it was simply to express his truth, to acknowledge the pain this incident had caused, and to show the community that he still believed in its unity. As he stepped onto the stage in front of the gathered reporters, John felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The mall had become the epicenter of the debate, and now it was his turn to speak up. He looked out at the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent, the tension palpable. "I know I've made mistakes," John began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I made a decision based on what I believed was right, but I can see now that my actions have caused more harm than I ever intended. I never meant to divide this community. I never meant to hurt anyone." There was a long pause as John let his words sink in. The audience was watching him closely, some with arms crossed, others with expressions that were unreadable. But he continued. "I'm not here to defend my actions or to say that I didn't believe in what I did. But what I am here to say is that I've learned something through this. This isn't about one decision. It's about understanding the bigger picture, and knowing that sometimes, even when you think you're doing the right thing, the impact can be greater than you ever imagined. I've heard from many of you, and I've realized that the pain I've caused doesn't just affect me, it affects all of us. We are a community. And I want to find a way to bring us back together, to heal and move forward." John's eyes scanned the room, feeling the weight of the moment. The response was mixed, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was doing the right thing. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew that taking responsibility for his actions, acknowledging the harm, and asking for the community's understanding was the first step toward healing. Whether they forgave him or not, at least he could stand tall, knowing that he had done his best. In the days that followed John's public address, something shifted, though it was unclear exactly what. The tension in the air wasn't gone, but it had evolved into something more manageable, something that felt, for the first time in weeks, like it could be navigated. The immediate aftermath of his statement was met with mixed reviews, as expected. Some applauded his honesty and willingness to admit mistakes, while others continued to criticize him for not standing by his initial decision. Yet, despite the polarized reactions, a sense of change was palpable. People who had been avoiding the mall now started returning, unsure of what they would find but hoping that perhaps the tension was finally starting to ease. At home, things weren't much better. John still felt the weight of the decision hanging over him. The press conference had been a step toward making amends, but it hadn't magically fixed everything. Karen had been supportive, as always, but there was a quiet undercurrent of tension between them now. She wasn't angry, she never was, but she was deeply concerned. Their conversations were less frequent, and even when they did talk, there was something unspoken lingering between them. The kids were quiet, sensing the tension around them, though they couldn't quite understand why their parents seemed so distant from one another. The mall, meanwhile, was slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy, though it would never be the same. John tried to stay focused on the day-to-day operations, but it felt harder than ever. The staff was still divided, some accepting his apology and others unwilling to forgive him, their discomfort clear in the way they interacted with him. But John knew that he had to carry on. The mall needed stability, and despite the fractures that remained, he was the one expected to lead them through the aftermath. There was no turning back now. As the weeks passed, things seemed to calm, but there was a sense of unease that lingered beneath the surface. There were still occasional protests outside the mall, and social media was alive with arguments over the controversy, but it no longer consumed the entire community. John found himself spending more time on the phone with other local business owners, many of whom had also been caught up in the chaos. Some of them offered their support, understanding that the situation was complicated and not as simple as the media had painted it. Others were still critical of him, fearing that his actions had opened a Pandora's box that would be hard to close. It was during one of these conversations with a local restaurant owner, Steve, that John began to realize the true extent of the damage. Steve had been one of the more vocal critics of John's decision early on, but now, as they spoke, he seemed less confrontational. "You know, John, I've been thinking about this a lot. I was angry at you when it happened, but I get it now. You were just trying to do what you thought was right. I don't agree with it, but I think you're trying to make things better. And that's all any of us can do, right?" John felt a knot loosen in his chest. It was the first time someone had acknowledged the complexity of the situation without vilifying him. He'd been so focused on the immediate fallout, the accusations, the judgment, that he hadn't allowed himself to see the bigger picture. Steve's words made him realize that he wasn't alone in his struggle, that there were people who, while they may not have agreed with him, could empathize with his position. But empathy was a rare commodity in the small town now. The divided opinions continued to plague the community, with friends no longer speaking to each other, families torn apart by differing views. What had once been a place where people gathered with ease now felt like a battleground. And as much as John wanted to ignore the divide and pretend that things were okay, he knew deep down that they weren't. He was still the focal point of a battle that had been raging long before the incident at the mall, a battle that had only been fueled by the firestorm he had inadvertently created. One afternoon, John found himself at a local park, sitting on a bench, watching the world go by. The sun was shining, children were playing, and life seemed to continue as usual for most people. Yet, as he sat there, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in a different world than the one he had known before. The park, once a peaceful place where families gathered, now seemed strangely distant to him, a place where he no longer felt at home. He stood up, stretching his legs, and walked to the nearby coffee shop. Inside, the barista greeted him with a nod, but there was a clear unease in her eyes. She was one of the younger employees at the mall, and though she had always been friendly, John had noticed a coolness in her demeanor in recent weeks. He ordered his coffee in silence, trying to ignore the weight of the awkwardness that had settled between them. When she handed him his drink, she hesitated before speaking. "You know, I was really upset with you when everything happened," she said, her voice tentative. "I didn't understand why you did what you did. But I've been thinking a lot about it, and I think I get it now. I don't know if I would have made the same decision, but I can see that you were just trying to do what was right. That takes guts, even if people didn't agree with you." John felt a pang of gratitude, but it was tinged with sadness. It was rare to hear such words now, and the fact that they were coming from someone so young, someone who had no vested interest in his situation, made them even more meaningful. He realized that it wasn't about winning everyone's approval or regaining lost friendships, it was about understanding that people were just trying to make sense of a world that seemed increasingly divided. And as much as he wanted to fix everything, he couldn't change how people felt. All he could do was continue to lead with integrity, continue to strive for the values that had always guided him, even when the world around him seemed to be falling apart. As he walked out of the coffee shop, John's mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. He was still unsure of what the future held for him or for the community, but one thing had become undeniable: he had learned more about himself, about leadership, and about the complexities of human nature than he ever thought possible. The mistakes he had made, the missteps and the regrets, would stay with him. But they had also opened his eyes to the profound truth that sometimes, the right thing to do is not always clear. Sometimes, it's about listening, about understanding that there are no easy answers, and about continuing to move forward, even when the road ahead is uncertain. That night, as John sat at the dinner table with Karen and the kids, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet relief. The world outside was still divided, still uncertain, but in that moment, at least for him, there was peace. And maybe that was all he needed for now. Peace, however temporary, felt like a small victory in a world that had become unrecognizable. As they ate, laughing and talking together, John allowed himself to believe that, despite everything, things might one day return to some form of normalcy. Not the normalcy of the past, but a new one, one that they could create together, as a family, as a community. He wasn't sure how it would happen or when, but he knew this: it would take time, and it would take understanding. And, for the first time in months, he felt ready to face that challenge head-on. Months had passed since the storm that had rocked John's life and the small town. The initial chaos had begun to subside, but the scars, both personal and communal, were still visible. The mall, once again bustling with customers, had found a new rhythm. The protests had faded into the background, and the heated debates that had filled social media feeds now seemed like echoes of a time gone by. Yet the quiet, simmering tension that had once seemed all-consuming had not disappeared. People were still divided, and John was still trying to rebuild not just his reputation, but the fractured community that surrounded him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, John woke up one morning with a sense of clarity. He'd spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had gotten so out of hand. Was it truly just one mistake, or had his decision been a symbol of something larger? The truth, he realized, was somewhere in between. The controversy had sparked a much-needed conversation about values, beliefs, and the limits of personal freedom, but it had also revealed just how deeply divided his town had become. The community that had once been so close-knit was now a shadow of itself, a reminder of the fragile nature of unity. John had been living in the aftermath of that chaos, trying to balance his desire for healing with the reality that some things couldn't be fixed overnight. What he hadn't expected, however, was that the final resolution would come not from his own efforts, but from an unlikely source, the very community he had struggled to understand. It began with an invitation, one that would set into motion a chain of events that would change the course of his life. It was a crisp Friday morning when the invitation arrived. John had been at his desk, sifting through the usual administrative tasks, when his assistant knocked and handed him an envelope. The envelope was simple, no logos, no grandiose stamps, just a plain, unmarked piece of paper. He opened it, half expecting it to be another letter of complaint, another scathing critique of his actions. Instead, what he found was a surprise, an invitation to a community town hall meeting. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and the letter contained an unusual request, a direct invitation for John to speak. It wasn't a typical community event. This was to be a gathering of local leaders, activists, business owners, and ordinary residents. The goal was clear, an open forum to discuss what had happened, how it had affected the community, and how they could move forward together. For John, it felt like an olive branch, a chance to face the very people he had unintentionally alienated. He could hardly believe it. After everything that had happened, after all the vitriol, he had expected people to want nothing more than to erase his name from the town's history. But instead, here was an invitation, an opportunity to come together, to listen, to heal. He was hesitant, unsure if he was truly ready for such a meeting, but something in him stirred. Maybe this was what he needed, a final chance to mend what had been broken. The night of the town hall arrived, and John walked into the community center, his nerves on edge. The room was already filled with people, a mix of familiar faces and strangers. The air was thick with anticipation, and for the first time in a long while, John felt the weight of every eye in the room. He knew there were people who resented him, people who still blamed him for the chaos, and others who simply didn't know where they stood. But what struck him most was the realization that this wasn't just about him. This was about all of them, the town, the people, the community that had been torn apart by one single moment. He took a seat at the front, waiting for the meeting to begin. The organizers had promised a structured conversation, with time for everyone to speak, to ask questions, and to offer suggestions. As the town leaders took the stage, the room fell silent. The energy was a mix of nervousness, curiosity, and a faint trace of hope. It was clear that people were still uncertain about what would come from this meeting. Would they actually listen to each other? Would they find common ground, or would the divisions only grow deeper? The first speaker was a local schoolteacher named Linda, who had been outspoken about the protests in the early days. She stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges, and addressed the crowd in a calm but firm voice. "We've all been affected by what happened," she began. "Whether we agree with what happened or not, we can all admit that it has changed us. But what I want to talk about today isn't just the past, it's the future. How do we move forward from here? How do we heal, not just as individuals, but as a community?" Her words hung in the air, and the room was silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, others began to speak. Some expressed their anger, others their frustration. There were people who still felt hurt by John's actions, and there were others who sympathized with him. It was raw, it was real, and it was exactly what the town needed, an honest conversation about the pain and the division that had resulted from the incident. But amidst the frustration, there were also voices of hope. There were calls for understanding, for dialogue, for listening to each other instead of shouting over one another. Finally, after several speakers had taken their turn, it was John's moment. He stood up slowly, his heart racing. For the first time in months, he didn't know exactly what to say. He had spent so many sleepless nights thinking about this moment, but now that it was here, the words didn't come easily. But then, as he looked out at the crowd, he realized that this wasn't a moment for rehearsed speeches or carefully crafted apologies. This was a moment for truth. "I've made mistakes," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know that. I've made decisions that have hurt people, and I've caused division when I never intended to. But what I've learned through all of this, what I've learned from each of you, whether you agree with me or not, is that we're all part of this community. And we can't heal if we don't listen to each other. We can't heal if we're not willing to see the humanity in one another, no matter where we come from or what we believe." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. John continued, his voice gaining strength with each sentence. I don't have all the answers, but I believe we can do better. We can disagree, but we can also understand. We can fight, but we can also forgive. And I want to be part of that. I want to help rebuild, not just the mall, but this community. Because we are stronger together, even if we don't always see eye to eye. There was a long pause after he finished speaking. John looked out at the crowd, his heart racing, waiting for the reaction. Slowly, people began to clap, and though it was hesitant at first, the applause grew. It wasn't a wave of enthusiastic support, it wasn't the loud, boisterous kind of applause that one might receive for a perfect performance. But it was real. It was a start. It was an acknowledgement that, despite everything, John's words had resonated. As the meeting continued, people shared their thoughts and feelings, some still critical, some more open. But for the first time since the incident, there was a sense of unity in the room. The walls that had been erected between the various factions in the town were starting to come down, piece by piece. It was a long road ahead, but John felt something shift inside him. This wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't a clean, simple ending to a messy chapter. But it was something. It was progress. When the meeting finally concluded, John walked outside into the cool evening air, his mind buzzing with everything that had been said. He had no illusions about how long it would take to truly heal the wounds that had been inflicted on his community. But for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this struggle anymore. The town had found its voice again, and together, they could rebuild. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with setbacks and difficult conversations. But it was a road they would walk together. And that, John realized, was enough for now. As he walked back to his car, he paused for a moment, looking up at the stars above. The night was quiet, the world calm. It was a rare moment of peace, and for the first time in a long time, John allowed himself to believe that, maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay.